Hey ho everybody, welcome to Bullock's Embarrassing Childhood Story Time. When I was a kid, my friends and I, we would sit around with a tape recorder and cassette tape recorder. A cassette, it was a thing like that you put into the tape recorder and you turned it on, you pressed record, and it would magnetically transfer the sound waves from your voice onto a strip of tape. It's a thing old people used when we were young, okay? But we would sit around with this tape recorder and we would word for word recreate Star Wars. Everybody would play a different character, and I would try to do my embarrassing British C-3PO accent. We had seen that movie so many times that we could do that. We could replay it in our minds and record it coming out of our mouths word for word. And I bring up that story not actually to embarrass myself, but to illustrate two important points. These are things that I am absolutely firm on. I will not move. I will not change my mind. This is always going to be the case. Number one, when you quote from a text, as this episode is going to be about, when you quote from a text, you must do it word for word. You cannot change those words. You cannot change the meaning of those words. So you quote word for word, just like we did when we were kids recording our own version of Star Wars. And thing number two, okay, it's not episode 4, A New Hope, it's just Star Wars. And no matter what you say, George Lucas, Han shot first. Theme song. Okay, everybody, we are at the end of Series 4. This is the last episode in this basic series on analysis, and as it says right over there, it's about quoting from the text. If you watched Series 3 about arguments, structured all through that series, particularly in the episode about using evidence, there were some things about quoting from the text, how to quote from the text, some of my rules about quoting from the text. I'm going to review those. I also have a couple of other things to say that are important and that directly relate to quoting literary text or informational text for analysis as opposed to using sources in an argument. So a couple of things that I want to review. I want to review this magic triangle. This is the quote, paraphrase, summary triangle. You can see that at the very top, in the very smallest part of the triangle, that is quote. Just below that, a slightly larger part, that is paraphrase, and then at the bottom, summary. What this means, if you did not watch Series 3, it's a pretty straightforward ratio for how much you should be quoting, how much you should be paraphrasing, and how much you should be summarizing when you're presenting evidence. And very clearly, you should try to quote as little as necessary. Now, because you are doing an analysis, it is vitally important that you do quote. If you say the author is presenting some particularly negative connotations, you need to say, here are the words in that text that have those negative connotations. You do not need to copy the entire paragraph in which those words appeared. So most of the time you're going to be summarizing what an author does. Some of the time you'll be paraphrasing, and when it is apt and appropriate and important, you will quote. But you can't overquote. I mean, you can overquote, but you should not overquote, which leads me to this second review. Quote the face, not the beans. Now, I know if you did not watch my series on arguments, and if you've never been in my classroom, you probably just said to yourself, oh my God, Bullock had a stroke, I'd better call 911. But it didn't, okay? It didn't have a stroke. Quote the face, not the beans is a metaphor. You saw that there is a large picture there that has a whole bunch of coffee beans in it. And through the miracle of Photoshops or something, the person who made this image has turned one of those beans into a face. And that makes it a puzzle. You're supposed to try to find the face. But the other image there is just the face blown up. And what I, as an English teacher, and what your English teacher, if your English teacher is not me, what we want is the face. We don't want a puzzle, right? If we wanted a puzzle, we would have assigned you to make a puzzle, but instead we assigned you an analysis. So think back a couple of episodes ago to that Gary Soto poem about Saturday at the Canal. That was the title. It's about these two boys who hate their high school, they hate their rinky-dink town, and they want to get out of there. If I were to try to claim in an analysis of that poem that the speaker was unhappy, I could quote the entire poem, right? Because that entire poem is an ode to Gary Soto's unhappiness, or the speaker's unhappiness. We can't assume that the speaker and the poet are the same person. But I could also just quote the first line. I hoped to be happy by 17. And if I didn't even want to quote that line, I could just paraphrase it and say, Gary Soto opens, or the speaker opens, by saying he's unhappy. If you think about a little bit later on, or right at the end of the poem, in fact, how the canal itself, the water in the canal, becomes a metaphor for the way the boys feel. I could quote an entire sentence in my analysis, that entire sentence, a couple of lines that Gary Soto writes about the water, but I probably really should only quote a little bit. I could talk about how the water was white-tipped but dark underneath. That's 5 words, just 5 words that say so much about the quality of that water, and so much about the way Soto, as the poet, and the speaker, as the speaker, was trying to connect the boys to that water. That water was able to escape. That water had some depth to it. And it was those 5 words that really made the difference. That's the face. The entire last sentence, the last couple of lines of the poem, that's the beans. I don't want the beans, people. I want the face. Okay, here's one rule, one very important rule that I have not explicitly said yet. I didn't mention it in Series 3 on arguments, and I haven't said anything about it here in Series 4. But if you've been paying attention, you may very well have picked up on it. And it's like this. If the author is your best friend, I don't care what you call her. But if she's not your best friend, then you'd better refer to her by last name. Okay? So if you're thinking about Hope is the Thing with Feathers by Emily Dickinson, we talked about earlier, you do not refer to her as Emily. The first time in your opening paragraph, you can say Emily Dickinson, and that's fine. Every time after that, you want to say Dickinson. When you're writing about Harlem by Langston Hughes, first time, say Langston Hughes. Every time after that, just say Hughes. All right, I got one more for you that I have not previously made explicit. And this one is probably a little bit harder to have intuited from the things that I've said before, but I did not say this back in Series 3, and I have not said it here yet in Series 4. And it is also very important, and it's this: no quote bombs. What's a quote bomb, you ask? A quote bomb is when you're going along in your paragraph, you're just da 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 this da 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 da, and then boom, you drop in a quote from the author, and then back to your stuff. You make no introduction to the quote. You maybe don't even put a tag on it, like Soto writes, if you're talking about Saturday at the Canal or any other Gary Soto poem. You just go boom, the quote, like an obnoxious tuba playing at noon, without any context, without any introduction. And even worse than not having an introduction, the biggest problem with a quote bomb is that you don't do any discussion after the quote. I know that I said back in Series 3, you should not end a paragraph on a quote when you're presenting evidence in an argument. And it is also true in An analysis. Don't end a paragraph on a quote, or don't drop in the quote bomb without anything afterwards about that quote. I, as your teacher, or whoever your teacher is, what we really want to see is not, did you find a few words that you could put into your thing in quotation marks? That's not what we're really looking for. We're looking for the thinking behind your selection of evidence. We want you to say, Gary Soto talks about the atmosphere at the school by saying there was, quote, an obnoxious tuba playing at noon, period, quote. This showed that Soto had no tolerance or no patience for pep rallies at his school. You need to make that connection. It's the warrant that I have talked about previously. So all of this, I mean, it is really all related. If you are doing a quote bomb, you're skipping that warrant step, that connection between the piece of evidence here in this analysis and your overall claim in that analysis. So please, no quote bombs. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, okay, warrant, whatever, but how do I do that introduce the quote business? What should I put before the quote? Two things. Number one, you need to make sure that you have something in your paragraph before the quote that says what part of your analysis you are onto. If you're talking about the symbolism of the water in Gary Soto's poem, Saturday at the Canal, in that paragraph, then you need to put that into the paragraph. You need to say, one thing about this poem is the way Soto uses the water as a metaphor or as a symbol for what the boys are feeling. You need to set up what this paragraph is going to be about. Once you've done that, you do need to put some kind of a quote tag. I said that word a couple of minutes ago, or maybe 30 seconds ago. I don't know how much of this I'm going to edit out. I'm just rambling here, people. I don't even have a script. I mean, there's an outline, but it's not a script. Anyway, what I'm saying is, you need to put some sort of tag on it. And for this, I cannot recommend strongly enough, They Say, I Say. This is a book that it literally provides you with fill-in-the-blank templates for academic writing, for argument writing, for analytical writing. You just pull out a template that says what you want to say and you fill in the appropriate blank. There's a whole section in there on introducing quotations, and it's got things like according to X, which you substitute the author's name, so like according to Soto, or in her book blank, X maintains that blank. So in her book To Kill a Mockingbird, Harper Lee maintains that you know, some semblance of racial empathy is necessary to be a human. There's the very simple X states, quote. So Soto states, quote, an obnoxious tuba playing at noon, unquote. That would work just fine. There's according to X, quote. So according to Soto, quote, or according to the speaker, quote, the hallway stank of unwashed hair. Okay? There's X complicates matters further when he writes. So maybe Langston Hughes complicates matters further when he writes, or does it explode? The first set of images are all disgusting. Syrupy, sweet crusted over, rotting meat, that kind of thing. But, or does it explode? Like, boom. It's starting to become a theme here. There's more. They Say, I Say has a whole section on explaining quotations where you can begin to write that warrant after the quote. Basically, X is saying, basically Soto is explaining that the water is just like the boys. X's point is that blank. Hughes's point is that when you keep a people down, they will rise up, and it will not be good for you. And finally, there's one of my favorite sections in They Say, I Say. It's the section on adding meta-commentary. Meta, M-E-T-A. It's a prefix that means about the thing. So meta-commentary is commentary about commentary. This would be the sentence that follows the sentence that follows the quote. And it's things like this. In other words, blank, or what blank really means by this is blank, or to put it another way, blank, or in short, blank. Really, these are templates, these are phrases that lead you to a second sentence. So let's imagine that you're writing about those last couple of lines of the Gary Soto poem, Saturday at the Canal. Those lines about how the water is white-tipped but dark underneath. So you might have that quote, and then your first sentence afterwards, the warrant, would be something like, in these lines, or in this image, Soto captures what the boys envy about the water, period. In other words, the water has the same depth they do, but it is privileged with the ability to race out of town. You see how by making that two sentences, by using this meta commentary template, it sounds infinitely smarter than it would if you tried to cram all of that into one sentence, or if you left that second sentence off entirely. And here we are. We're at the end of Series 4. Let's just assume that the guys over in editing are going to add some balloon drops or confetti or something awesome. But there's one last thing. All of this is very important when we talk about quoting from the text. Quoting the face, not the beans, no quote bombs, don't use just the author's first name. All of that supremely important to remember. But there's one other thing that gets so deeply under my skin, so hard working my last nerve. And it's when students use the verb quoted or quote. It would be something like this. The water becomes a symbol for Gary Soto and his friends' desire to leave town, right? Soto quotes, or Soto quoted, white tipped but dark underneath. Don't. Just don't. That's not an appropriate use of the word quote. You would only use that as a verb in one of your templates trying to introduce a quote. You would only use that if the author you're writing about was actually quoting someone else, right? So if you think back to the Brian Stevenson text that I've referred to repeatedly, A Presumption of Guilt, Brian Stevenson does quote other people, and you would say something like, Brian Stevenson quoted a historian, okay? That's the only time that you would use a verb like that you would use quotes or quoted in your analysis, is if the person you're analyzing actually did quote someone else. That's it. That's my last word of warning on quoting from the text. The next series up is going to be about rhetoric, so all of that rhetorical analysis stuff that I alluded to earlier, and I said there would be a later series about it, that's what's coming up. And I will see you for the next one. So if you think back to a couple of episodes ago when I was talking about, it wasn't a couple episodes ago, was it? It was the last episode. No, it was 2 episodes ago. Crappity crap.